This panel is, of course, the first speaker, a dear friend and a very good commissioner, and a dedicated speaker for freedom, transparency, competitiveness, and human rights. Neelie Kroes will start this panel, and I'm so happy that you can be here. Out of the EU 2020 program, there are the targets and the 7 flagships. And I think the flagship with the most potential when it comes to competitiveness and growth and transparency is, of course, the digital agenda, which also is the only flagship with specific targets and a possibility to check on what's happening. And this is, of course, typical for Neelie Kroes, who is always hands-on when it comes to results. Erkki Aarmala is the guru of Nokia, or the guru of the market, a person who knows the internet and the telecoms business inside out, and also is not discussing only business, but also, of course, society and what comes with the new technology. And this I find very fascinating. And then we have a very distinguished security expert, Mr. William Chesnick from Network Security. And Mr. Manuel Konstam, President of Cable Europe, on the fiber issue, and Silvana Koch-Mehrin, who is Vice Speaker of the House, Vice Group Leader of the Liberal Group in the Parliament, and also an expert in digital issues with a number of reports and dossiers on her conscience. Brian Williamson, Plum Consulting, also very welcome. Is mobility more important than speed? Very tricky issue. And now what we are facing in front of us is not only, of course, the challenge for Europe to keep up competitiveness with other parts of the world, and being a group spokesman for the EU 2020, I work with this daily and see the problems we have, but also a number of very important choices we have to make when it comes to legislation and the future of the internet and the future of the business, and also the future not only of the market but of the human beings and the human rights for those people that are affected or participate in any way in the ICT activities. So I am looking forward to this seminar immensely, and I won't talk any longer, but I will leave the floor to Neelie Kroes, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lena, for the introduction. And I'm aware that I'm a privileged person for not only being invited for this seminar, but also being aware that the ALDE group, again, is proving that there is a delivering on a better future for Europeans. And I think that looking around that with all those parties involved in this conference, we could indeed make a step forward, so to say. And I need partners in my fight for delivering, no doubt about that. And if you could join me for the major effort for securing Europe's digital future, then it's my day, so to say. And having said that, it's not only talking about members of parliament, talking about members of the universities and research institutions, also the industry. And I see a lot of representatives of the industry in the room. So we are aware that our future, you and my future, so to say, lie in high value added services. And then we are talking about the digital agenda. The digital agenda, it is nearby history, so to say. Now we are implementing what we were taken as a decision, Parliament, Council, and of course the Commission. And we are aware that in the delivering is the moment of truth, so to say. So help yourself by helping the rest of us go digital is one of those lines that could make sense. And that is critical to both our economic and our social well-being. And the platform for making this changes happening is great ICT infrastructure. And that is the specific element of the digital agenda, so to say, and I want to elaborate a bit on that today. By the way, history shows us that the great boost in quality of life, in jobs, in enterprises, in towns, and whole industries are built on the back of great innovations, innovations like electricity and highways and sewage. And it's now clear that the current and next waves of great innovations are mostly related to ICT. And if we want a strong future for Europe, and that is no question about, we need effective use and development of ICT. And I'm absolutely certain that all of you have heard me mentioning in as well Parliament and many other places on earth my belief that fast internet access is like digital oxygen. And that is the sort of essential nature of those infrastructures. So while I am aware of the highly ambitious nature of our internet targets, and again, I'm repeating, every European digital by the end of 2013, and a massive expansion in ultra-fast internet by 2020, I also believe we have no other choice. So it is a matter of just thinking through and concluding this is it and nothing else. And for anyone who thinks the internet is for young people or fun, I want to correct that impression. And I'm not saying that you have that impression, but be aware that it is not only for young people and that it is not only for fun. The internet is both fun and highly used by our youth, but it's much more than a toy or a luxury. It is, in fact, the way to give full meaning to Europe's core values. For just look at the recent events in Egypt, but not only in Egypt, in Tunisia it all started. And the way turning off the internet there has been used to offend the values of freedom and solidarity we hold dearest. And especially the ALDE members are absolutely protectors, fighters for those values of our democracy. And just look at the possibilities offered in fields like e-health, where internet-enabled technologies are our only way to fill the care gap that will soon emerge. And indeed, online commerce is like the perfect laboratory for the single market. A borderless commercial environment, or at least one that would be, if we brought our regulations up to speed with the technology. A lot to do. What are we doing in concrete terms to help Europeans and their governments to take advantage of that wonderful platform? Last September, Lina, we delivered our broadband package and the first major follow-up since the announcement of the digital agenda in May. And that included an NGA recommendation, the first radio spectrum policy program, and it spelled out how different levels of government and various partnerships could better invest in broadband. And there are several themes that run through all the elements of this package. Offering maximum certainty to maximize investment, focusing on practical actions that minimize cost burdens, and requiring clear action plans at national level. Because world-leading internet infrastructure will not become widespread by chance. And that broadband package, ladies and gentlemen, is just the first step of many steps in the next few years. The infrastructure also needs to be secure. Cybersecurity is a challenge that will not go away. Trust and security online are key conditions for the success of all new applications. And that is why I have proposed a new mandate for ENISA, the Agency for Network and Information Security. And that new mandate for ENISA is already being discussed in this House. We need to find an agreement that allows that agency to be most efficient to secure our networks of today and of tomorrow. With my colleague Maros Sefcovic, I've also launched an interinstitutional project to build a single CERT for all the EU institutions by 2012. Very ambitious, but I think that if we are asking other parties to come in line, that we should give our own example too. And we need to agree as soon as possible. Cyber threats do not wait for us to be ready, so to say. And those steps form a journey that we must all take together. And that journey is about Europe keeping pace with developments in the nations we consider our peers and competitors alike. And that is a fast-moving world, and it's full of great opportunities, challenges, but only if we are bold enough to invest in them. So whether it is public leaders and officials like those of us in the room today, or entrepreneurs and business managers, investors, or community activists, each group will benefit from fast internet. And each group is responsible for working with the others to find local solutions. And at the European level, we can enable the right conditions, and we will. We can get rid of the obstacles, and we will. We can help fund the essential long-term research, and we will. But my main message is that this is a joint effort of millions of people and billions of euros. And every last person and every last euro that can be mobilized is sorely needed. So the question is not just what the Commission is doing to implement the digital agenda. It is also, what is your organization, your community, your family doing to implement the digital agenda? It is all of us who are involved, and it's all of us who, at the end of the day, can take a big advantage out of it. I think that we need to speed up, and I'm on your side, and please be on my side, and then we will be successful. Thank you.
Of course, listening to you, Commissioner, you get a lot of answers, which I think is quite good for a commissioner. But also there are some question marks. Now, there will be a question and answer session just after the speeches, which will be headed by Mrs. Valian. But how do you see, just one question. The US invested so much in this technology, and also for the citizens. Do you think we could come up to the same speed, or are we at the same speed, or how do you see from a competitiveness point of view? So we will take all the other issues later on. Be calm.
There is no choice, but that sounds too negative. We should take the lead, but anyhow we should be at the same level. And having said that, we are preparing a meeting with all those who are involved in this issue, and that will be next month. It's already February, hopefully, and hopefully we can inform Parliament about what we are planning and what we hopefully can reach as a result.
Do you think you have the same view on openness and transparency as your the negotiating partners on the other side of the big sea?
There are a couple of differences, no doubt about that. Also talking about net neutrality, our competition issues are a bit different, and I'm proud that we do have competition, and I'm certainly aware that you and your party members are on the same line. Having said that, we need each other. So this is a sector that's cross-border per definition, and not only cross-border, it is a global scene in which we have to operate. So it is quite clear that we have to communicate not only with the United States, but also with all the others that are involved in this same development. But let's do our utmost that we will be anyhow in the forefront of the whole caravan.
In the plenary. So maybe, yes, the next speaker, please. Yes. Would you like to introduce Mr. Ormala?
Yes, first of all, I do apologize, but the plenary today ran 40 minutes late. I mean, not 10, but 40. It was definitely not at the high standards of the debate we have today on a digital agenda, but this is the case. I also want to salute everybody and especially thank to Commissioner Kroes to be with us today. It is, being said so, my pleasure to introduce Mr. Erkki Ormula, who is the President of Digital Europe and Vice President of Nokia, will introduce us in a topic about the competitive single market in Europe. Please, Mr. Ormula.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner, distinguished members of the Parliament. It's my topic today to discuss about the market conditions, because it's, of course, vitally important to have the infrastructure, but if we don't have the conditions, how we can deliver, so then there is no chance whatsoever that we will be successful. Let me first illustrate where we are. What are the challenges ahead? We clearly know that today our main emphasis in the middle of fiscal crisis. And we fully understand that most of our energy is focused on short-term fiscal consolidation, which is, of course, an issue that must be resolved in an appropriate way to restore our macroeconomic stability, which ultimately is the precondition for economic growth and prosperity in Europe. But, however, the world won't wait. Therefore, we need to address urgently the growth opportunities that will restore the economic growth and job creation. If we look at the world, China is growing by 10%, India plus 8%, Southeast Asia between 4 and 6%. And this has now been going on for 15 years. And that will continue, obviously, for the next 15 years. It's expected that China will bypass US by 2030. It already became the world's second largest economy last year. And therefore, the environment where we are living is changing fundamentally. This will have dramatic consequences on our ability to create growth and jobs in the European context. We in industry, we have now for more than 2 years advocated very strongly that we need digital single market. The creation of digital single market by 2015 would yield a 4% point growth in the European GDP by 2020. There is the growth opportunity. This would correspond approximately 500 billion in terms of increase of annual revenues, roughly 1,000 euros for each European citizen. So that is a growth opportunity. We all know the problems of cross-border commerce in Europe. Less than 10% of the e-commerce in Europe is cross-border. Currently, extending business from member states to another may create 2 million euros additional cost for a company due to diverging rules and regulations in the member states. No wonder that young European ICT entrepreneurs will rather extend their business to the US than to go to another EU member state. We are very pleased that the EU digital agenda is addressing most of the concerns that we are facing today, and we work very closely with the Commission and with the Commissioner in order to be able to deliver, because the question is to be able to deliver. The topics today that we are holding important are the topics on the digital agenda. If we think about the copyright reform, the data protection and privacy, consumer protection rules, intermediary liability, the fragmented use of radio spectrum, problems with standardization, payment system, electronic waste arrangements. We know that the list is long. The time won't allow me to elaborate every single topic separately. Let me just select 2 topics, not because they would be more important than the others, but because they have turned out to be the most controversial in our discussions. We need to reform the current fragmented copyright system in Europe. It's clear that we need to create a European licensing system for copyrighted content. And secondly, we need to reform the outdated copyright levy system. Both of these are major concerns for European consumers and industry, not only for the ICT industry, but also for the creative industries. They violate the single market rules, as shown by Mario Monti's report on the completion of the single market in Europe. They stimulate piracy, create legal uncertainty for industry, and recent studies show that, for example, people spend on digital music 3 times more in those countries without the levy system than in those countries with levies. In France and Germany, roughly 2 euros per person. In Japan, US, and UK, from 5 to 8 euros. That explains how this system is fragmented in European development. And finally, which is the prime concern here, is of course that the content created by the creative industries in Europe is gradually being transferred to companies outside Europe and distributed back to European markets, leaving the economic benefits outside Europe. This is a significant problem for the European creative industries. They don't have the delivery system for their content in the way that they would be able to use European partners in the distribution, but they have to rely outside partners. In a similar way, fragmented privacy and data transfer rules erode European single markets and the benefits it could bring. In the context of cloud computing, data transfer is a natural part of business practice and therefore the necessary step to ensure that the European citizens could benefit from the development of this new opportunity. We need to harmonize the rules of data transfer and protection, as well as the IPR management in the European context. As an example, due to the fragmented data privacy rules, we have to notify the data transfer practices for industry may cost up to 500,000 euros per country, which of course large corporations can cover. But think about an SME who would like to transfer data from one country to another if they have an entry cost of 500K every time when they move from one member state to another. Completion of the digital single market is a major challenge for Europe. It is our most valuable tool to remain competitive in the digital industry. It is unfortunate and frustrating to follow the debate in Europe, where countries in principle all agree that digital single market is an important ambition, but reserve the right to exclude their particular interests outside the digital single market. A case to the point is my country, Finland. Finland has set the completion of the digital single market as the primary objective of her EU policy, but wants to exclude consumer rights and protection outside. If this, when 27 countries will do the same, you will understand that nothing will move. If ever, leadership is needed in order to bring digital single market into reality. If we look what's happening outside Europe, we see that the lack of single markets is marginalizing Europe from one of the most promising growth opportunities we have in the global economy. The digital content and data services, only for mobile users alone, represent $240 billion in terms of annual revenue, 2010, growing by 30% a year, reaching $380 billion by 2013. The recent data shows undisputedly that Europe is losing ground rapidly. European websites are virtually absent from the list of most visited websites in the world. And even more alarming is the trend what we see happening in the growth of the leading internet service companies in the world. I had the pleasure of visiting China last week, and we see it is not anymore only the US which is dominating this space. Chinese internet service providers are challenging the American companies with hundreds of millions of customers and rapid expansion to foreign markets. Among the 5 most valued internet companies in the world, after Google and Amazon, are 2 Chinese companies, Baidu and Tencent, with over 30 billion market cap, well ahead of eBay. No European company is visible on this list. I trust that the European Parliament, the European Commission, and its ALDE group will support us in this important endeavor to bring the digital single market into reality and to preserve the way of life we so highly cherish in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. In order to introduce our next speaker, I want to say a few words about networks. Networks are at the core of our economy, and the society is becoming increasingly dependent on internet. And while internet is playing an extraordinary part in shaping the society. We have to keep in mind that it has not been created with security in mind, and it has its downsides. Cybersecurity threats have increased significantly over the past 5 years and are evolving to the point where they pose a significant threat to both private and government institutions. Cybersecurity is a multi-layer approach, and the fundamental part of it is ensured at the network layer. While we are aiming at building and financing the digital highways, I believe decision makers should require the highest levels of network security in order to design robust and reliable networks. But we do not have to disregard the privacy issues in this debate, because this is the other side of the coin, and protecting the freedom of our citizens from sometimes intrusive businesses deserves as much as attention. Our next speaker is Mr. William Cheswick. Mr. William Cheswick is an information security expert with a very long experience, currently working for AT&T. So, Mr. Cheswick, what are the cyber threats we should watch out for in the coming decade? Mr. Cheswick.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I usually give the keynote speech at those weird technical conferences that your IT people go to. Don't usually get to feedback to people who make policy. And I've been thinking about these things for a long time. Most of the internet graybeards who invented parts of the internet are friends of mine. Many have been to my house. We exchange papers. We talk about it. I've been doing this since the mid-'80s. I started using the internet in 1985. It was a research project back then, and as far as I'm concerned, still is a research project, which you people have made very complicated recently. But we're still trying to figure it out. It is quite a remarkable achievement. The engineering was done by small groups of people sitting around exchanging short notes and little memos that settled on a specification called TCP/IP that was pretty much laid down around 1984 or thereabouts. There have been a few tweaks since then. And that engineering result has worked over 9 orders of magnitude of growth. That is astonishing, and it is amazing that this is working as well as it is. And thank you very much for joining in my playhouse. I started working at Bell Labs in the late 1980s and realized that this was a dangerous place and started working on firewalls. I did some of the first work on firewalls. I co-authored a book on firewalls that your IT people probably have on their shelf someplace. And I've been thinking about the security issues of the internet for, I guess that's, 25 years now. It has not been a good time. Internet security was never easy, and it still isn't, and I'm afraid I'm not going to leave you with magic bullets when we're done here. I should tell you I work at AT&T Shannon Labs. This is in New Jersey. There are several hundred PhDs I work with immediately there. We have others, a few thousand in other places that are also working on it. We are spun off about 15 years ago from Bell Labs. You may remember them, the folks who brought you the transistor and information theory and a few other minor items. That spirit still continues in a smaller group at Florham Park, and I love working there. To give you an idea, we're earning about 2.5 patents per business day. I was good for about 4 applications last year. There's something in the water. The ideas just flow. We do about 300, 350 professional papers. Most of them are obscure to me. Most of the people are PhDs or otherwise distinguished. And I love the lunchtime conversations. It's just a wonderful place to work. I imagine it must be, though perhaps only in 1 or 2 languages. What do we do? Well, we have a giant company with huge databases, vast volumes of data, and many, many problems that sometimes are easy to solve and sometimes take a lot of hard work by world-class statisticians, visualization experts, database experts. What we call a large database is something that maybe the folks at CERN wouldn't be impressed with, but pretty much everyone else would be. The company we work for is AT&T. It's the largest backbone provider in the US, carries about 20 petabytes a day. Now, frankly, I've sort of glazed over with these Greek prefixes on number of bytes. I believe petabytes is 10 to the 15 bytes. I'd have to go check again. These numbers are getting ridiculously big, and it's growing about 50% a year, which has been pretty much the way the internet has been working for a long time. This experiment is really, I think it's going to go somewhere. And we're doing research into trillion bit per second lines. How do you watch these? How do you manage them? How do you tell what's going on? How do you satisfy government queries about this? This is all data reduction. It's a big deal. So there are a lot of network security challenges. It used to be the hobbyists that attacked the internet. You know the joke, the teenage boy who couldn't get a girlfriend was breaking into places, or a researcher who perhaps went a step too far. That is not what we're seeing now. We're seeing criminals getting money, and they do it. They employ professional programmers who do fine work to do what they break in. There's also been espionage going on for at least 15 years by many governments. And even if you had no proof of that, it would be foolish to think that there wasn't, because it is so easy to break into systems, so easy to exfiltrate data. Of course people are doing it. The bottom line, and maybe my key message here, is that information and internet security is really, really hard. It isn't because stupid people are working on it. It isn't because grandma picks the wrong password. It is because there are so many links in the chain that some parts are going to be weak and easily attacked. And you're not going to fix all of that here, no matter what you do. You can try, you can help. I've been asked by senators, how can we fix the internet, Ches? And I go through half a dozen ideas, and no, it's not that easy. But I think you can do things that might help. Doggone it, we ought to win. This is my computer, it's my software. It doesn't belong to some guy in Latvia with bad breath. It's mine, and I ought to be able to secure this. And that is an engineering goal, and we haven't done very well to get to that. The internet is complicated. The original design of the internet, well, before the internet, there was the phone company. Complicated in the middle, stupid telephones around the edge. The phone company had all the smarts and took care of everything. If you wanted to change something, you had to change it in the phone company. The internet said, no, we'll have a dumb middle and smarts around the edge. That works great, and that really is the beauty of the internet. You could find two people who would come up with an idea, pick a number, start talking, no permissions needed, and bang, you've got the web. That's pretty much how these services started. It's wonderful for innovation, and the idea was that the center would be stupid. It would just pass data along. I can tell you, as someone who works for a company that handles a lot of data, the center isn't stupid anymore, and you don't want it to be. It's hard, it's complicated. I think we've handed out some pictures of a simplification of the internet. I don't know if you have some handed there. I'm not sure. Anyway, you've probably seen these before. These big splat maps of the internet. It shows just, the 250,000 most important routers on the internet. This is a complicated place, and we have to manage it. We get flows of data, and we have security issues. We want to find out where the next botnet is coming from, and they experiment first. A week before a virus hits, they're out there trying it, and we see that. We have ace security people on our network who know when bad things are coming because they can see the tests and trials. We also have some things do need to be solved in the center of the net. For example, denial of service attacks. If someone wants to send 100 billion bits per second to your website, you're not going to stop that at your website. That has to be diverted somewhere in the center of the network. We do that sort of stuff. So what are my concerns for 2020? Well, these attacks are going to continue. Grandma is still going to be attacked. She's still going to go to websites like phishing sites. There are always going to be people out there fooling the users somehow. Unfortunately, education's really not the answer. It isn't grandma's fault that she's going to the wrong site. It's poor engineering, and it's hard to get that engineering right. We're much better at building bridges than we are building secure computers, and we're going to have to keep working on it. Part of the problem is that people pretty much just want to drive across a bridge. When you get a computer, you keep saying, oh, I want it to do this and this and this. You keep changing what we're aiming for, and it's very hard to engineer something that actually settles down and gets secure. Another concern of mine is privacy. And I know this is an issue, especially in Europe. It is in the US as well. And I assure you it is on our lunchtime conversations. I'm a security person. I don't know if you realize this, but security people are paid to think bad thoughts. So I walk around with a very dark view of the world. How would I blow up that bridge? How could I crash this computer? How could I steal data, and what evil things could I do with it? And we have discussions along these lines. And then, of course, the good guys go a step further. How do we stop it? How do we tell if someone else is trying to do it? How do we engineer around it? I'm worried about privacy because I can see a lot of attacks. We already see it. Government has data, industry, kids put them up on their Facebook pages, and internet archives. You can go, if you are online right now, go see email I wrote back in 1986. Someone saved it. I don't think it was worth saving, but it's there. And you can take all this and put it together and learn a lot. Now, it helps if your name is Bill Cheswick, because there aren't too many of us in the world. If your name is John Smith, maybe you're actually hiding a little better. So some of this might be accident of birth. Those of you who are about to have children, you might think about that. Do you want a unique name or not? So this is an issue. The other thing is that, yes, this data is dangerous, and you can think of bad things. You can also think of really great things to do with it. Stuff that helps you as an individual. Should my computer know how I drive to work and warn me when my usual route has an unusual traffic jam? That would be great. I'd love that. I'd pay a little money a month for that service. Now, is that Big Brother, or is that Stephen Fry, the butler, helping me out? I want to see more helpful butler things. This device is a butler for me. It helps me do my work better, but I don't want someone spying on me using it. This is a delicate balance, and you policy folks get the unenviable job of trying to make the rules work so that we get the butlers and not the spies. So to close up, I have some advice and observations since you asked. Thank you for asking. As I said, this is hard. It's been hard for 25 years. It's still hard. We're not going to have it solved in another 10 years. And I don't care what your policy is. This is difficult. If you reduce expectations, we might have a better job at it. Education isn't the solution. I'll bet that's never been said in this room. Yes, obviously we need to educate more people in computing and so on, and I'm not saying we shouldn't teach our children proper security, but it isn't grandma's fault that her machine was hacked. That is a different problem and a hard one. It might be her fault in that she didn't pay enough for a secure enough machine, but we don't offer her one. By the way, when I talk about grandma, the person I call grandma worked on controller code for the UNIVAC 3. Grandmas aren't necessarily stupid, they're just not informed. Starting out fresh is another idea I've heard. Oh, well, the internet's a mess. Let's just go over here and we'll get these experts and do it right. You hear this popping up every few years. Let's do it. That's sort of an insult. It implies that the people who did it before didn't know what they were doing. And what's going to happen is you'll build this network and eventually people there say, we want to play with that other network too. And now you're just like every other company or government in the world connecting to the internet. So save your breath. Information exchange and availability is useful. When you decide as a government entity to put up a website for people, I ask you to go the extra 2% and put up a machine-readable version of the same data. There are technical specs, XML, things like that, so that if somebody wants to use your data in some new way you haven't thought of, you make it easy for them. We've had some experiments out there. It works well. Suddenly innovators swarm around your data and do things you never expected. Not all of them good, sorry. None of this stuff is perfect, but it can be quite astonishing. I recommend you go that extra step. And by the way, some bureaucrats like to sit on data just because it's theirs, and maybe it shouldn't be. Make them release it, if you can. Let's see. I guess I'll finish up by saying, let's see. Yeah, okay. The security problems aside, the internet's really working. I mean, how many people here do online banking on the internet? When I ask a room full of paranoid security experts, I get 80% hands raised. That's not really broken. I mean, the bankers might disagree. They have their fraud to worry about. This is working pretty well. Let's not break it. The one of the real beauties of the internet when they were first coming up with these specifications was they want to specify just enough to make it work, but not over-specify. Let's leave that open. We'll let people work that out. We just want to be able to talk. We'll figure out what to talk about later. I encourage you at your policy level to try to achieve that same balance. It takes wisdom and discipline, which I'm sure is common. I guess, all right. So finally, I should tell you, I dream of the future of the internet with lots more packets, in lots more places, lots faster, and lots cheaper. And I say this as an American abroad where my data isn't so cheap over here this week. Aim for that, and I think you will find rich rewards in communication and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cheswick. Thank you very much. We are pushed to think outside the box right now.
That's what I do.
That's very good. We thank you. In order to achieve the targets for very high-speed broadband access, we need a lot of investments in fiber. So that's why I'm asking Mr. Konsam, the president of Cable Europe Association, to tell us more about what needs to be done in this field. Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Actually surprised, David, that your data bill here is higher than in the US because prices in Europe are generally lower for broadband connectivity.
It really gets you as a traveler.
That's true, that's true. So I'm here today as president of Cable Europe. We are connecting about 7,000 cable companies. That's right, that's how many companies there are still today in Europe, serving about 73 million customers and connecting 110 million homes, or about half of Europe's households. Dear Chairman, Madam Vice President, and honourable members of Parliament, thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I'm really glad to see ALDE helping to drive the digital agenda. Commissioner Kroes ended her speech with a very interesting question. What are you doing to drive the digital agenda? A clear and direct challenge to all of us, and to me, and to our companies. I'm here today to tell you that the cable invests billions in the rollout of high-speed broadband and innovative interactive television, and I will give you some very tangible evidence of the stuff we do to drive those targets. And one of the things I like about the digital agenda as a concept is the way Vice President Kroes is using it. It rightly inspires Europe to think about investment and innovation in a very positive way. When it comes to the digital economy, Europe has a lot to be proud of and should not be shy to show it. Positive coaching is what we need most at this stage. Any of you who have ever spent some time coaching children's sports clubs know what I'm talking about. Successful football or hockey teams receive the right dose of critical feedback and stimulating words, but most of all, a positive confirmation of one's own capabilities. Accurate, but positive. This is what you've trained for. You can do it. You can win. And bolstering self-confidence today is as important in the intensely competitive world we live in as corrective messages. And in this world, Europe needs to compete for jobs, business orders, investments, research and development with very, very self-assured countries such as China, South Korea, Brazil, and the United States. Their leadership focuses a lot more on positive coaching than on any commiserating regarding the things they cannot do. Have you ever heard a Chinese or an American leader say on any industry, we are really running behind the rest of the world. If we're not careful, we will lose out against those Europeans? I've never heard that. No, because they're looking forward. And we commend the digital agenda for its focus on Europe's bright future, in which certainly the cable industry are ready to play a role. Of course, we need to be realistic and recognize that there are areas where we need more European entrepreneurship and investments. And my colleague from Digital Europe referred to that on such areas as copyright and completing the internal market conditions. But let's wrap that in a positive message and build on the things that really work well. And we think that this is the right approach for the European broadband industry. European Commission's broadband package is a great kickoff to achieve this. Keeping in line with that kind of positive thinking, look at the OECD's 2010 numbers on fixed broadband penetration in the world. 14 countries out of the top 20 were European. For mobile broadband, Europe occupies 17 of the top 20 rankings. Europe, of course, wants to be successful in convincing more inward investments, research and technology, so it needs to amplify those messages with strong communications and self-marketing. Just like our Commissioner for the Digital Agenda, we should not be shy. And here we need to underscore an important point. Infrastructure competition is the name of the game. And Europe has a lot more of it than the United States, or even Korea, for that matter. Much of Europe today is covered by at least 2 fixed infrastructures and often 3 mobile broadband providers. In those regions where that's not the case, of course, public funding can help. But where there's actual and potential for real infrastructure competition, funding has no place, and regulatory intervention, in our view at least, should be reduced to the minimum necessary. European cable networks contain over 100,000 root kilometers of optical fiber. In many networks, cable operators have taken fiber to less than 100 meters from individual customer premises, with the last part of the network still connected with a high-frequency coax cable. All over Europe, cable operators have rolled out DOCSIS 3 technology over these hybrid systems, and our most popular products with consumers today are faster than DSL with speeds at 25 to 30 megabits and up to 120 megabits. These offerings have become affordable and fairly easy to reach for almost 50% of Europe's 200 million households. Some are even experimenting today with 400 and 1 gigabit connections, as Kabel Deutschland Group just did before Christmas on a standard cable network in Hamburg. And not only the speed has gone up tremendously, but also prices have come down quickly. Cable's price per megabit on average in 2008 was only a third of what it was in 2005, whereas most telecom incumbents only half the price in the same time frame. Cable is working hard to deliver on those broadband targets and to the entire European consumer base. Next month, we are expecting the launch of a new report by Zolon Management Consulting, and I will see Madam Vice President and the honourable members of Parliament for you to get a copy. And according to this study, we should see a best-case scenario in 2020 where it's 51 million or 27% of all European households subscribing to high-speed cable offering of at least 100 megabits or higher. So we can say that we at least do our part and deliver half of the 2020 Digital Agenda Challenge. And we need to deliver. Let's not forget about that. We don't do it just for the face of it. Our dear competitors will not sit still in the meantime. Faced with 120 megabits cables competition, we expect Europeans, telecom incumbents, to restart the big investments in fiber very, very soon. They have been underinvested a bit in the past years at 12% capital expenditure as a ratio of revenues for most of them, to the 23% capital expenditure as a percentage of revenue that most cable operators have been spending in the past 6 years. Cable is an instigator for investment and something that this report will focus on. Hence, the more EU policies help us and others and telecom incumbents to invest in networks, the better contender we will be in pushing the rest of the industry to respond and build more fiber of their own. Together, we will grow a critical mass of connectivity to arguably the best performing and largest IP infrastructure region in the world. Networks made of multiple fixed and mobile network operators carrying voice, video, and data, whatever mix it makes to make it work. There's a couple of small remarks to that. Networks serving consumers are increasingly technology agnostic and focused on digital lifestyle and experiences more than the physical characteristic of the networks we build. It sounds a little bit tragic, but our customers, trust me, they couldn't care less what kind of network is taken to get the signal to them. Today, our customers care about what social network or online community they belong to, how portable the digital product they buy on their various devices, and what kind of premium product they can see, and whether they can access their own content, their own music and videos in their home. And I can assure you that's also the way we're building the future in our digital high-speed broadband systems and media gateways for interactive television. Our customers should feel a maximum freedom and security in using the networks and services of their choice. On any typical weekday in my 120 megabit house in Amsterdam, each of my 4 children is doing their homework online, chatting on Facebook, listening to streaming music, and watching a TV series at the same time. This is a demanding generation who will never go back to the broadband dark ages below 100 megabits. I think that everybody in my house considers fast internet access to be the digital oxygen without even knowing about it. Yes, Commissioner, it is essential, and I think we all agree on that. That generation will ensure the creation of a new digital value chain that can boost growth in Europe's digital economy. And we would be delighted to get your positive coaching in achieving that. We look forward to continuing to work together with you, European Parliament, and Vice President Cruz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Constam. Now I would like to ask Silvana, my colleague, Mrs. Silvana Koch-Mehrin, to pick up from what Mr. Constam was saying and talk us about the digital highways.
Yep. Thank you very much, Adina. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm in the very fortunate situation of being here as the 5th speaker, and where a lot of things have been already highlighted and said, and I think it gets more challenges even for the speakers afterwards to still find their specific niche. So, but I'm again very happy to follow the speech of Manuel Constam, because where he kind of left off, I think it's very good point to pick up, because he was talking about the new generation and their expectations and the digital natives. And I would like to reflect that towards the European societal reality and the challenges that lie in that for policymakers, because that what you described about your children is absolutely true for your children, and I can see that becoming the truth for my children, even though they get kind of maybe a bit too small for that. But this is not the majority of people living in Europe, and this, with regard when we talk about access, is a big issue that we can't ignore. Because what we can see today is that our society changes fundamentally, because the way that we communicate changes so fundamentally. And this has implications on how we live, how we work, how we think, how we look at main concerns of society. And I think it's very easy to just think back and say that maybe only 5-8 years ago, paper was the main, so to say, tool for communication. And what was written down in newspapers, what you found in documents lying on your desks, what you were reading in books, this was the tool with which you worked and with which you communicated. This has totally changed today. Today, you're not that much worried if you don't have fresh bread in your house. You're worried if your internet access is down, for whatever reason that is. If there's no electricity, if there's, well, just for a moment, the network down, that's what worries you, because communication, access to that communication, is become a fundamental tool in living together in Europe. And if we again then look at what society is like, we can see that we have enormous digital divide, and this is a matter of age and education, because we have a 3 times higher literacy or internet usage of those between 16 and 24-year-old Europeans compared to the ones which are between 55 and 74. However, the age group between 55 and 74 is the majority in Europe. So this poses questions, all these great opportunities, the challenges that we have. We need the single market, the digital single market. There's no question about that. We need to empower consumers to be able to know about their rights and to use that. We need the technology to have safe internet access. All that is absolutely crucial. But if the majority of society is then not concerned about it, is not using it, and the other part of society is moving fast ahead, this causes a divide that we can't ignore as policymakers. We have enormous successes, and Commissioner Kroes, Nelly, she highlighted that. We have, within a very few years, doubled the the share of households which have access to broadband, that is a great success, and that's again something talking and thinking positively, like you said, that Europeans should do. This is something I think where the rest of the world can envy us for, that in a very few years we were able to achieve a lot of progress there. And we can also see that more than half of the individuals in the EU use internet on a daily basis. Compared to other continents of the world, that's also quite good. And also something which tells a lot about European society, I believe, is that 1/3 of the internet users is very concerned about security issues. For security issues, they don't put up personal data. And that's something which also is a reflection maybe for you guys from to be able to find a market here, which is maybe even more tangible than maybe other parts of the world. But putting all that together in a nutshell, we can see that the demographic projection, and you're all aware of low birth rates and the fortunate situation that people are living longer these days. We have right now, for one person retired, we have 4 people working. In only a few years, there will be a ratio of 2 people working and 1 person retired. So it's quite a dramatic change. And this is, well, your point in having access for free and low cost is something that obviously is an important one. But I believe we have to get to a way that we have that we achieve the situation that we have more silver surfers. That's what they, what at least some of those people call themselves. That we have some sort of an enlarged generation contract. These days we usually talk about those working being kind of responsible for setting up the retirement schemes for the older generation. I think this generation contract has to be enlarged in a way that we get the internet access generation across generations, and also have a new generation maybe between the not so stupid grandmother and the extremely intelligent grandchildren, as you pointed out. So that this is something that policymakers have to keep in mind, alongside the very important development of single market, consumer rights, technology, subsidies, things that have been discussed here. I think a very big challenge for Europe lies ahead in the societal change, and this should be included in policy areas. I keep it very short because I think there should be still room left for question and answers, and I just wanted to highlight a few points there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvana. We still have another panelist, is Ms. Williamson, who have to tell us what the consumers think, if this investment justified or not. Is there a demand for these investments or not?
Thank you, and I'll just say a little bit about how I came to these issues. I, several years ago, thought a lot about networks, really, broadband access, and more recently have been involved in work around consumer behaviour and applications and content. And I think I've come to see those things as very intimately connected, and therefore a change to one of them can have a ripple effect on the others, and I'll be talking about that. I'd also say I've put up a provocative title, Is Mobility More Important Than Speed? It's not that I don't think speed is important. Of course, one would rather have a faster connection than a slower connection, but I won't say anything more about that. There are some slides in the pack which may be helpful, but I'll talk to them. The first one basically shows this very recent and rapid rise in take-up of smart devices with a different kind of interface, the touch interface, and with applications developed by third parties. I'm astounded when I look at when this started. I mean, Apple started the App Store in the Q3 2008, so we're talking about something that happened roughly 2 years ago. There are now a few 100 million of those devices in people's hands, and it's rising at a rate of a few 100 million per year at the moment. So there are about 1 billion people in the developed countries. That means that, roughly speaking, most people will have these sorts of devices by, say, 2015. That is a faster change than broadband. Broadband really didn't exist at the turn of the century and got to around 2/3 of households recently. So you're seeing this device shift happen very, very fast, the shift from the focus on the computer to these mobile devices. So what does it mean? Well, one thing we observe is that people have fairly high willingness to pay for these devices. Even during a recession, people are spending substantial amounts of money on smart devices, so they want them. They like them a lot. They find them useful. They also seem to have fairly high willingness to pay, and some would disagree with this, for the data access, because if you buy a smartphone, part of the price you pay is for the data access. That's not always revealed in the statistics about data revenues because it's bundled in with the overall tariff. But you know, there's a big difference between a basic phone and a smartphone, and some of that's the data. The other point I'd make is that fibre is fast, but the speed of fibre outside the premise is 0. And actually, a lot of the time, what matters to you is what you can do when you're not at home, when you're not sitting in one place. So, you know, fibre's fast, but the speed of fibre is 0 when you're outside the premise. If we then think about, so I think that the high willingness to pay suggests there's a lot of, you know, the normal economic benefit to this, and we'll see a whole applications ecosystem developing around these devices. I think they will also impact on networks, and I'll say a bit about that. In terms of applications that have benefits that go beyond the private benefit, the benefit to the user, I think you're seeing a huge number of these being developed now. And some of them inherently depend on the fact that you can carry the application with you. Some of them inherently depend on the fact that the device has a camera or some other kinds of sensor built in. And in the slides, I have lots of examples of these that I picked out of the App Store. Health, there are many applications for health services, glucose monitoring, first aid applications, and these, I think, do have benefits that go beyond the individual benefit. Increasingly, you see these social transport applications, which actually do utilise open data sets. It was a point made earlier in the UK now, a lot of the data sets that government holds are being opened, and you're seeing a lot of third-party innovation around apps for smart devices that tell you when the train will arrive, whether there is a bicycle available. We have these social bicycles now, as many other European cities do, and I use them sometimes. That application will tell me not only where those bicycles are located, but in real time how many bicycles are available. And that makes a huge difference to your willingness to use that kind of transport. There are disability applications for sign language and so on. There are civic applications where you can report, for example, graffiti or something to the local authority. You just take a photo, it's geotagged, it goes to a website. And there are many educational applications, some of which you could not do over a fixed connection with a computer. So I think we're seeing this development of a lot of applications which actually are inherently, they only work with a mobile device. Okay. On the network side, it's complicated, and 2 years ago I thought it was clear-cut that demand for bandwidth would steadily rise and that therefore the business case for fibre, for example, would progressively improve. I'm less sure now, and partly based on the way my behaviour has changed now that I have these devices. I will access the internet through, say, a smartphone at home, even though there's a computer a few metres away. It seems odd, but it's more convenient somehow. And often that means actually my bandwidth demand is lower, and I've done a few tests on these things. If you use the iPhone, for example, to do two-way video calling, it's around about 200 kilobits per second. It's a very low bandwidth requirement. If I watch TV on the iPad HD, 1.5 megabits per second, not kind of 8 to 10 that you would have for a television set. So some of the behavioural changes and the screen size mean that you need less bandwidth. I think it's just unclear how this will play out. Fixed and mobile are both substitutes and complements, and things that are both substitutes and complements, a trend is not a good predictor of the future when things are like that. And I'll give one example, which is historical and was about something that did revolutionise the economies of the world, which was steam. Steam was one of the great technological revolutions, like IT. And Initially, people thought that steam would substitute for sail on ships, cargo ships. Actually, it made sailing ships more competitive because people used the steam to run winches and reduce the labour requirement on the ships. So for a long time, actually, sail dominated until about 1900, I think. And only then did steam start to substitute. And I think fixed and mobile are a bit like that, and it's hard to call how that's going to play out. I think some people will drop the fixed line at home, others will see it as complementary to their other behaviour. And I think that makes the investment decisions around networks quite tricky in terms of what people will do. And they're predominantly the uncertainty there is behavioural. On to another theme about digital inclusion and take-up. We know that roughly a third of people in Europe don't use the internet, or certainly haven't in the last 3 months. That's the question that's asked. We know that a lot more of those people are above 50 than under 50. We also know that actually there's a big north-south difference. If you look at southern Europe, about 20% of people over 50 use the internet. In northern Europe, it's about 70%. What's the explanation for that? It's not entirely clear, but one thing you notice if you look around the world is that countries that have grown fast recently in the last few decades, and that includes Korea, have lower internet use among older people. And I think that's probably because the generational difference in education is bigger in those countries. In the US, where people have been wealthy for a long time, the differences are smaller. And it may surprise you that in Korea, use of the internet is not that high, actually. Broadband adoption is universal. Use of the internet is not higher than Europe and is particularly low among older people. Now, I think what's interesting is that if you look at the movement in these graphs year by year, it's not budging a lot for that older group. It's not moving up much. It would take an awfully long time on current trends to see a significant increase in internet use. So I think that's partly about the devices. We've tried to teach them to use computers, and computers are not very nice things to use, actually. They're not that intuitive. They're complicated. And I have an anecdote about someone I showed an iPad to at Christmas she's about 70. She said, "I don't like computers." And I said, "Well, try this." And she immediately got the idea that there were applications there that were useful, like something that told you what the weather would be. And she said, "Well, I get lost on computers." I said, "Well, with this, you just push this button. It always takes you back to this screen." And then quietly she said to me afterwards, "Actually, I think I'll get my husband one of those for his 70th birthday." So I think, you know, in terms of digital inclusion, the kind of PC paradigm, it's useful. It's good for people like me producing content and doing work. For the final third, I suspect it's going to be a struggle, and we might as well think about an alternative way of getting those people to use internet-based applications. And by the way, they don't really need to know they're using the internet. They just use an application. It may help with affordability as well if mobile broadband is a more attractive option. And some people like the fact that they can manage their expenditure through prepay. We've seen that get to universality on voice. I think it will help with the broadband story as well. And one thing I'll say about this in terms of this pace of change and how you can misjudge things, and he's not the only one. Bill Gates said in February 2010 about the iPad, "There's nothing on the iPad I look at and say, oh, I wish Microsoft had done it." Well, he was wrong. And I think that's the thing, you know, it's not just a device. We now see it changing demands on networks, but also starting to change the content industry. Less than a year into the release of that device, you see people releasing content which is specific to the iPad in anticipation of a large market in the future. So a change in the device is rippling through all the other bits of the system, and I think we need to think about that. And I have one final slide where I really say I think we need to reassess everything because of this change. It wasn't obvious to me 2 years ago. It's obvious now that it's important. Quite what it will mean, I don't know, but some things I think are obvious already, and we need to think through everything again, in a way. I'll stop there.
Well, this was our last panelist. Now I want to open the floor for questions and answers. So, wow. Yes, please. Introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Bridget Cosgrave from Digital Europe. Apologies, not seeking to monopolize, but a question for Madam Cruz and members of European Parliament. Consistency among the various policy initiatives of the Barroso II administration is very important. We see the rise of the discussion of the cohesion policy, and we have two questions we would like you to ask Commissioner Hahn. Where is the duct, and where is the dish? So at the next occasion, when he is supporting initiatives for cohesion policy elaboration, for building of roads and rail infrastructure in the new member states, can we ask him where is the duct, so that the duct is laid for every kilometer of road and rail, and where is the dish, the satellite dish on the roof of every building that is refurbished with cohesion policy funds? Thank you.
We'll take a couple of questions and then the panelists will answer. Yes, please.
Caroline Jacobson, European Metal Workers Federation, representing 6 million workers in Europe. Commissioner Kroes, what is the message or encouragement that you would like to offer to the workforce in the European IT industry in their participation in the enforcement of the digital agenda in Europe? Thank you.
Yes, please.
So my name is Trond Undheim. I work with Oracle. It's a large computer systems vendor. It was mentioned here that TCP/IP as a standard was invented in 1984, and I'd like maybe some comments from the panel on the fact that despite that fact and the fact that it's the backbone of the internet, I believe it was Mr. Ormela who said that we have certain standardization problems in the EU. I think that's a slight understatement, given the fact that it's actually technically illegal to use the internet in the EU, and Madame Cruz knows that because there is a standardization proposal on the table finally from the Commission to allow standards from foreign consortia, global standards organization, to actually operate their standards and be recognized and to be procured in Europe. Now, I was just wondering maybe if ALDE was aware of this challenge and if you plan to endorse this legislative proposal when it comes, hopefully, on the table in April, and maybe your comment on that in the context of what can be done between the very techie things that are so important and the very, policy things that are sometimes mismatched with techie things.
Yes, thank you. Then we stop here to give the opportunity to our guests to answer. I would add to your questions provocation for Mr. Cheswick to tell us something. Cyber threats in social networks. What are the risks there? And if there are social networks with more problems, let's say, or more susceptible than others, this would be a question for you. And also for Mr. Ormala, apart from standardization, maybe you can address a bit from the perspective of single market, the issue of so various languages and cultural diversities, and how do you see the link or the solution in between for a single market and digital world? Of course, for all the questions, the panelists are asked to contribute. First, I wanted to ask Commissioner Cruz.
Cohesion policy. I couldn't agree more that we should take all the opportunities and all the instruments that are available to be at stake for developing this great step forward. We have some experience, so to say, and we know that it won't happen just out of the blue sky, so to say. So we have to push it, and it is, by the way, and that is the advantage of the digital agenda, it is a Commission point of view, so all my 26 colleagues are just connected with the 101 proposals, the list of what to do, and I'm absolutely certain that also colleague Haan is very much involved in this issue. Having said that, and one of those issues, it is also talking about the municipalities, and it is talking about the lower levels where people should be aware that if you are combining activities, that sometimes if you are just taking those activities of putting energy, infrastructure or whatever, that it makes 30% less cost for the broadband issue. So point taken, and again, you can be aware. Workforce. This is the best report talking about growth of jobs and growth of the economy. For this is delivering, if we are indeed realize those investment programs, then you are talking about the type of jobs that are, if you allow me to say so, the low-level jobs that don't take that much time in starting up. So please mention to your people that this is the best they can get, but then we have to speed up, for it is a matter of now or never, so to say. And having this investment and having the coverage of the broadband, and it's not only broadband to fiber, it's also cable, it's also the satellite. So it is a diversity of opportunities, so to say, but it is all working and realizing a infrastructure in which that new area where my keep were touching upon, that is giving the competitiveness of Europe a boost, so to say. It's not only talking about standardization that we have to deliver, and that is a matter of the college that has to be quite active in it. It is also talking about copyright. There are quite a bit of issues that do have a political part and that have a technical part, so to say. And that is at stake, where not only ALDE but all the other groups in Parliament should be aware that if we are taking too much time for side issues, then we are losing opportunities. And for me, it is absolutely certain that it should be a combination, and we should speed up, and we can't afford to take too much time to indeed just go in depth and say, there is an election over there and there is a sensitive issue in another country. And what Mr. Ormala was mentioning, every member state, all the 27, have to realize that talking about a digital single market is not only talking about a fantasy. They were and they are all member of that family, but then you also have to behave like a member and a full-fledged member, so to say, and not making a difference between, at the end of the day, your own situation and your own conditions compared to all the other ones.
Yes, please, Mr. Ormala.
Yeah, just two remarks. First on this labor question, that we see this digital agenda and creating the digital single market as a major growth and job opportunity. We have estimated that bringing broadband to the whole Europe would create 1 million additional jobs. At the same time, we see that we have some skill shortages in Europe, which is the other side of the coin that we need to address, that we are in a shortage of experienced software people, particularly in Europe, and therefore we would like to see that the education system would take more into account these kind of concerns. Because we know that in high-tech, every single job in the high-tech sector generates 3 jobs in the economy more widely. The languages are not a problem. We know that we have to offer the services in the national language, because otherwise people won't use them. Therefore, this is a kind of a self-evident condition that we accept fully, and therefore we are not talking about the language barriers. We are talking about the regulatory barriers that we are currently facing. We have, for example, mobile phones currently, we are offering in more than 120 languages. It's not increasing the cost, it's just putting the software into the device, and therefore it's not creating any barrier in principle to deliver in different languages. So those kind of traditional barriers, they are not currently our concerns. We are much more concerned about the type of issues that I try to address in my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jasper, please.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments. First of all, I was slightly startled to understand that I am breaking the law using TCP/IP in Europe. This is a bit of a surprise to me, in part because despite claims of American hegemony, Europe was quite active in the early days of the internet. In particular, there were quite important sites in the UK and the Netherlands and elsewhere. But I assume this is just some bureaucratic thing. I imagine it's a little hard to decide that a pile of notes and memos, some of which have been lost, can form the basis of something instead of, I don't know, some ITU 2,000-page document. But I leave that to you. I'm going to continue using it and let them come get me if they want to. The issue about social network privacy policy and issues, this is really very new. You know, 10 years ago there was no Facebook, and we were just seeing our first social networks. It is certainly true that teens and college students have used this extensively. It's an important part of their social life. I certainly alarmed my children when I showed up on Facebook. It turns out I could get an .edu account from my old alumni from my college, and I could join in with the crowd. And this really focused them on security and privacy. There's some things they want their friends to know, but maybe not mom and dad, and certainly not the person who's going to try to hire them in a few years. I think I've seen, from what I understand, there's a lot more awareness about being careful of what you put up and who's likely to look at it. There is the question, of course, whether the company that runs these sites, these companies, are actually keeping the stuff secret. Are they doing it right? Do people understand the privacy policy? I happen to know of some emerging research that suggests they don't, that the privacy policy they're getting is not the one they think they're getting, simply because they misunderstood things. This is still a problem, and I don't have good answers for it because I think it's so new that we're still sort of grappling with what it means just as social beings, much less as regulators, on what it means. I like my Facebook account, actually. I do some interactions. It's useful for me. One of the decisions you have to make in life is how much do you want to share with your friends and potentially with strangers. And now this decision means more than it would to some farmer in 1840.
Please.
On the social issues, I think ICT will offer a lot of benefits, there's no question about that. But technological revolutions, and I think there are three I think of: steam and rail, electricity, which ran through to about 1930, and then ICT and the internet in particular. Each of those was disruptive, and we should anticipate that. Some people will lose their jobs and other people will gain jobs. There will be dislocation as a result of change. And you saw in each of those technological revolutions a period where income differentials widened. That happened around before 1930. I think it probably happened with steam and rail, and it certainly has happened in the US in particular with ICT. It's now attributed to some extent to that. So I think we have to anticipate that change is disruptive, and some people will gain more than others for a while, and we have to do something about that. So.
Thank you. And Mr. Constant, please.
Yeah, perhaps two remarks. One on the kind of rural extension. Today, cable operators kind of reach 73 million homes in Europe with actual connections, actual kind of live subscriptions, but our networks pass around 110 million homes. So there's still a group of around 35 million that could be served if we were to be successful to compete with our competitors in winning those customers over. but also as a matter of policy when new projects are being built, to your question, we try and co-invest with city councils and actually all cable operators do so, very often also together with incumbent telco operators or other alternative telecom operators. And we estimate that by between now and 2020, another 10 million homes will that way become available for potential cable delivery. On the social networking situation, I think the European Commission itself published some interesting statistics last summer, which hopefully will be kind of subject of debate again at Internet Safety Day, which is, I believe, in a few weeks' time in February. 93% of all 9 to 16-year-olds are currently in Europe online at least once a week. 65% of all 9 to 16-year-olds have a Facebook or similar social media kind of profile, but only 27% of all 9 to 16-year-olds actually have a privately shielded public profile. So actually have managed to find the privacy settings on their system so that they are actually keeping mom and dad off their Facebook and all the others that will be creeping in. That is something that should concern us all, and I think also believe firmly that that's not something that we can rely entirely on the regulator or the legislator to look at, because these developments by definition will go so fast that legislation by definition will be too late. And education also is something that will be needed, but will also be too late for many. So certainly the business community has a big responsibility here to be kind of self-propelling, to anticipate these issues and to find new ways creatively together and in different fora how to enable these customers and these young customers even to protect themselves.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. We really appreciate, and as an answer to the question if ALDE will support, ALDE is into this digital agenda very much, and we would like to see you together with us, because the answer lies there, not necessarily in the House of the Parliament. We have to listen and try to help you, not to impose on the industry our ideas, lab ideas. But we know this very well. Well, Commissioner Kroes is also a liberal, and so this is a guarantee for a good digital agenda and market. Well, thank you again to everybody. I invite you to follow our next panel of experts who will be chaired by my colleague Jens Rode. So please, Jens.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jens Rode. I'm the shadow of the RSPP program for ALDE. And in the first panel, we heard Vice President Kroes outline her vision for a digital Europe. A very important tool is a better use of our spectrum, because a better use could lead us and can lead us to more choice of services and lower costs for the consumer. To get there will demand a wide range of things. And some of the key ones for ALDE are, first of all, of course, courage to get ambitious on a European level, keeping the 2013 deadline for freeing up the 800 megahertz band, better coordination and more harmonization, also to prevent interference, auctions that must allow for the entry of more operators in the lower bands, banning hoarding, huge investments, spectrum for research and innovation in the bands made available by the transition to the DVB-T2 technology, and of course ensuring spectrum for public protection and disaster relief. Now allow me to present our next panel. First, welcome to Chris Vertain, Chairman of BEREC and the Regulatory Authority of the Netherlands, Dr. Sam Poltridge from the OECD, Mike Byrne, Chairperson of the RSPG and Commissioner Camrec of Ireland, Jonas Bengtsson, General Counsel Tele2, and Carlos Lopez Blanco, International Office Director of Telefonica. Now, I have always been impressed with the Dutch telecom regulator, so I'm very happy to have Mr. Fontaine here with us today. And Mr. Fontaine, what can we learn from the Dutch case? I give you the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's always nice to start with a compliment, so I mean, people can get a bit disappointed later. And I'll get back to the Dutch case. Pleased to be here. Pleased to see that ALDE puts this item so high on the agenda. As you know, BEREC was last year formally instituted, also to deliver opinions to Parliament. And I just would like to outline that we're working, of course, with the Commission and Council, individual regulators, but happy to do so also with Parliament. Again, I will start my talk with a view from my position as a chair of BEREC, the European organization of regulatory authorities, and then I'll take, indeed, picking up from the chair, what we've done in the Netherlands and why things sometimes work differently than you would hope and you would expect them to do. But the Netherlands is an interesting country because it is relatively far advanced in broadband penetration, and we see some developments there that could be meaningful for other countries. Let me do that and show you how we have tried to come to sustainable competition, because competition obviously is the focus that we take, at least from our view. If we look from a BEREC perspective, from a regulatory perspective, I think it's fair to say that we all embrace and support the digital agenda. We recognize the necessity and the important role of broadband penetration, broadband networks that can play in society, of course, has been discussed earlier. But we feel that it's very important to note that we are convinced that the effective competition, sustainable competition, plays a very important role and is the key driver to do so. If you want to have competition, you will hear from competitors there are two things they want. Regulatory certainty, whatever you regulate, but be clear about it. And secondly, consistency, don't change it in 3 years' time. Those are the key drivers, and that is basically the thing we try to focus on, and how we will interpret the regulatory framework, the NGA, Next Generation Access recommendation, and also the digital agenda. And we do that by applying various measures in various countries. I'll come back to the harmonization issue in a while, but we recognize that it is very important. There's always a lot of discussion about that, at some stages, some countries are very much advanced and some are not, and that you need to apply various measures in different situations. What we do in order to get there is that we monitor these national experiences, we exchange best practices, we help regulators in various member states to do what they are supposed to do. And also, as you know, we play a very important role when the Commission intends to issue serious doubts and eventually a veto on a certain proposed measure. By using those tools, we can apply indeed, one, the consistency, but also we guard the thought that you need to apply various decisions, various approaches in various backgrounds. Regulatory certainty is key, but as we have seen in some countries, it may lead to foreclosure of new entrants. If you give somebody who wants to invest too much regulatory certainty, he always wants the competitors of his network. And that, I guess, is the balance that we are constantly trying to seek, and I give you in a second what we've done in the Netherlands. Again, we've always based our advices on flexibility in various countries, applying the same measures only in the same regulatory situation. If you look at the differences, because there are vast differences across Europe, you see a vast difference in the level of infrastructure competition, presence of cable, yes or no? Fiber to the home networks, yes or no? The level of regulation effective in various countries, yes and no? The level of available network capabilities, cost differences vary widely across Europe. Availability of ducts, type of housing, type of geographical areas. Clearly the Netherlands, which I will take as an example later, is a relatively easy country to develop your networks, and there are of course countries in which it is very difficult to do so. And also we see something that is not within our remit but also very important is the role that national authorities take in assisting development of broadband by local or national aid. If I take the Dutch case as an example, we have 3 years ago been confronted with a great force and power to invest by the acting parties in fiber and in broadband. And we have been faced as a regulator in the Netherlands with the question on how to regulate that, and the balance indeed was how to foster this investment drive and competition. And we have, I think, at the time we were very proud, but the consequences were a bit different than we had thought. We came up with a very practical approach by why we have indeed regulated open access to the network for the joint venture between the incumbent and a construction company that were going to do that, and we gave them longer-term security on the revenues they would be able to extract from the access seekers, to the extent that both the joint venture and the access seekers were satisfied in doing that. Predictable, stable price regime in combination with policy rules that would go further than just the 3 years. Regulation based, because that is still the thought in Europe, on infrastructure competition. But, and now I come to the but, at that time we were really very hopeful that fiber to the home to be built by this particular joint venture would create competition on the cable, would create an enormous rollout of fiber to the home. Those ambitions now, and there are various reasons for that, not alone the financial crisis, those ambitions are now considerably lower by the parties that are actually investing than they were in the first place. And we have seen in my country only very limited unbundled fiber competition so far. We've seen competition based on the classical copper access, but we've also seen very positive effects, but a little different than we had thought. We've seen an enormous investment by the cable industry that indeed has been able to attain a superior level of competition. We welcome that, we favor that, but it's not exactly what we had immediately intended. We've seen in our country a geographical scale which does not really allow the competition to step up yet. Indeed, we are a little bit disappointed in that. If you look, however, into the other investment, and that is why my point is that when you regulate, you don't always get exactly what you want, but there are very important side effects, and we've seen those. We've seen serious investment in fiber to the office rollout, KPN, Eurofiber, and others. We've seen, as I've said, very serious investment in the cable network operated, Ziggo, UPC, the great Netherlands companies. We've seen large investments in cable fiber to the home upgrades. Even the Rabobank has entered into the play. And also we've seen further investments in the upgrade of the DSL network and extra investments in mobile data internet. In other words, we've seen, if you think about development of broadband, we used to think sometimes a little bit too much of fiber to the home development, and we see various players coming into the situation. And we see in my country, also forced by regulation, a continuous innovation and investment in various infrastructures, and a very strong competition between cable and the incumbent. And I think what is important to say is that as regulator, we would not be looking at favoring one technique, one engineering system or the other. We are there to favor innovation and investment and competition. And again, as I said, although the fiber to the home is perhaps slower than we had thought, the development in general is very much what we had hoped for. Now, in conclusion, Chair, the ambitions of the digital agenda are high, but I think they are rightly high, and I think regulation has an important role to play, but obviously not the only role to play. Then, even in a country like my own, with a traditional strong cable industry, a strong incumbent, a relatively densely populated country, sometimes developments go slower than you expect, and that, of course, puts some relativity on the development in other countries. We have sometimes been a little bit disappointed. It is absolutely important that regulators, politicians, parliamentarians are working together in order to develop the various instances that are necessary. We have, as BEREC, identified the development of broadband in this year's work plan as one of our key areas. It is clear that only part of it, an important part, but part of it falls within the remit of competition regulators. There are very important other issues at stake, and what we will do this year is develop a report reaching out to the other instances and advising the Commission in first instance, but also Parliament, on how to take that policy further and how the role of regulation should be taken further in the short term. So that is we are very hopeful that we can contribute, and we are also convinced that we have a very important contribution to make to the digital agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We all look forward to that. And as we all know, there are several of models of regulatory frameworks in the OECD countries. And Dr. Poltridge will take us through some of them. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the invitation to the Liberals and Democrats. And before I start, the standard disclaimer that OECD countries may not agree with what I say, so it's me saying it. It gives me much more freedom. It gives certainly them the freedom to object. What the organisers asked me to do was look forward in OECD countries to 2020 and perhaps where broadband may be. And that's always a dangerous thing when you ask an economist to do that, because we tend to be a dismal lot and you may get a dismal answer. You're not, I hope, but that's the danger you run. And that's the danger that a large telco ran about 20 years ago when they asked me a similar question, and to look at the first high-speed network trials around the world, then taking place in places like Biarritz in France and Miami in Florida. And the conclusion I drew then was that not only was the network not designed for what people were trying to do with it, and that was the PSTN, as much as we all loved it and as much as well designed it was for its original purpose, but there weren't simply the services there that were going to demand any need for an increase in broadband. We kind of knew that fibre would be the end game, but it was very hard to see how we would get there. And then along about 15 years ago, along came the World Wide Web, and for the first time we started to see what might be demand for higher speed networks. And I think for the first 7 or 8 years that I was at the OECD, from before the web drew attention to around the turn of the century, a lot of our work was about how to make the PSTN more efficient in delivering internet services, but also bringing in other infrastructures such as cable and wireless that we've heard about this evening. But in large part, it wasn't so much about broadband. It was really trying to get competition working, trying to get infrastructure competition working. And in large part, OECD countries had a fairly similar model. The other thing I did about the turn of the century was I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see how countries were doing with broadband, even though it wasn't very well penetrated at that stage. So I started off a broadband comparison, the statistics that you heard about in the previous panel. And at that stage, in large part, there was no residential broadband. Korea had just started. For various reasons, the US and Canada had started, largely because of convergence and the cable companies trying to get a leg up on the telcos. And that's about where we were. And in many European countries, for example, there still wasn't any residential broadband. And that has been largely the last decade, I suppose, that we've tried to introduce broadband across the OECD, to leverage the PSTN DSL as much as we could, to bring in cable broadband, and certainly to bring in wireless broadband. Now, that brings us up to about today. And when people think about OECD countries, what they think about is like-minded countries. You know, OECD countries, they think kind of the same, they have the same goals, they go along largely on the same paths, and we like that at the OECD. In fact, if someone goes off too far in a different direction, we tend to have these peer reviews that say, why are you doing this? What can we learn from it? Why aren't we doing it if it is more efficient or more beneficial to our citizens? And it's been quite surprising in about the last year, 2 years perhaps, that we've started to see quite a difference in OECD countries' approaches to broadband infrastructure. And in your packs that you have, I did a chart which is not entirely satisfactory, but it kind of gives you an idea. And it's the one with the blue top if you want to have a look. And what I've tried to do is just show the different approaches that OECD countries have introduced in the last year or so in terms of market structure. And I'll just split them into three groups for the remaining 2 or 3 minutes that I have to talk to you. On the one side of the chart, you have what I call the end-to-end infrastructure competition model, which has largely been the model that we've had in the OECD since we introduced competition. You have a couple of countries at the top, like Mexico and Chile, that have very dismal penetrations of broadband. You have a couple of countries like Canada and the US that have pretty good penetration of broadband. And you have two of the countries that are absolutely leaders in terms of most measures of how people see broadband, and that's Korea and Hong Kong. Now, what these countries share is a sort of end-to-end infrastructure model where you have cross technology competition, you have people offering services and infrastructure together. So largely the traditional model since we've had competition in telecoms. Moving across the chart, you have mostly the European countries. And one thing I should say about the countries that I first spoke of is they largely don't use unbundling, which kind of sets them apart from Europe, which has used unbundling to fairly beneficial outcomes, I would say, particularly in France, where I'm resident. It's just fantastic what they've done with unbundling in terms of the competition they've got going. You have different European countries, and I won't talk too much about Europe because you all know about it. You have the experts here. But you have governments, regulators using tools like functional separation, operational separation, as well as unbundling, as well as end-to-end competition that we've heard about. And then, on the end of that chart, you have another set of countries. And they are going quite in a radical direction in terms of the last 10, 15 years of communications competition. And they include, at the top, Australia and New Zealand, which are introducing a kind of structurally separated market. And one of the large differences here is that the governments have actually stepped up and said, we're going to fund local access infrastructure, we're going to separate that local infrastructure from the delivery of services, and it's a quite different model. Singapore, in a way that I don't have time to go through, is doing a similar thing, again using public funding. And then I threw in another one from left side, India, which is discussing a national fibre network, but using wireless to basically leverage off that fibre network. And again, like the previous countries in that line, using public funding, which is quite different in terms of telecoms. For those of you that have been around telecoms long enough to remember, before competition, basically telecoms were used by governments to raise money more than put money in. It was a form of taxation in many ways. They owned the networks, they charged what they wanted. That's why you paid $3 to call from Brussels to New York. This is quite different. It's quite fundamentally different. While all the governments in this chart are to some level putting money in, they may be putting it in rural communications or in some other way, those governments on the end of that chart are actually going back into governments owning networks at the infrastructure level, funding those networks, and that's quite a different model. So, Mr. Chair, to meet my time, I'll stop there and I'll hope there's questions in a while.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poltridge. And our next speaker is Mike Byrne from Ireland. And Mike Byrne, one point that we often hear in the discussions is that the Commission proposal is a one-size-fit-all approach, and that won't work considering the very different starting points for the countries. Of course, you cannot deny that different levels of development, but does that inherently prevent harmonization of the spectrum suggested in the RSPP?
Thank you, Chairman. And good afternoon, or good evening as it is now, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you, Chairman, for affording RSPG the opportunity to speak to the ALDE group today, and in what has been, I think, so far an excellent seminar. I think that we're all well aware, and it's been commented on a number of times already today, that possibly one of the greatest challenges facing Europe is knowing how best to stimulate our economic growth. It has been many times demonstrated that ICT can play a crucial role in driving competitiveness, increasing job creation, and supporting better quality communications for businesses and for citizens alike. Digital inclusion leads to social inclusion for individuals, and digital inclusion has been seen to provide many benefits, including significant savings for government, improved academic performance, better access to vital services, and overall positive impact on GDP. By recognising the key role that spectrum plays in supporting these objectives, we can maximise its contribution, a contribution that is potentially very significant. The RSPG plays a central part in ensuring those benefits are achieved by providing the best possible strategic advice on how spectrum policy develops and identifying how it can be most effectively managed, thereby ensuring the best outcome for all. We've heard today quite a number of the high-level policy objectives as articulated by both Vice Presidents, and I think we would all concur with the overarching need to develop policies that fit the strategy that has been developed for Europe through its various different communications. However, high-level policies adopted at a European level that apply service and technology neutral principles can increase competition, facilitate innovation, and support consolidation of the internal market. Using spectrum to facilitate ubiquitous broadband can maximise the social and economic value that applies to radio, that can maximise the social and economic value that applies to spectrum, which is a natural national resource. So in the way of radio spectrum, we in Radio Spectrum Policy Group consider the resource that we are managing is very much as a natural national resource, as important as other national resources. Just if I may, I might say a few words about RSPG itself, particularly for the members of the Parliament. The Radio Spectrum Policy Group clearly is a high-level group of advisors that advises the European Commission to date on the development of radio spectrum policy. The group comprises high-level government experts from each of the 27 EU member states and is also represented by the European Commission. And I'm honoured to be the current chair of the RSPG for 2011. We provide strategic advice in the form of opinions and reports, as well as issuing statements from time to time, which are aimed at assisting and advising the Commission at a strategic level on issues around spectrum policy. And that spectrum policy, from a Commission perspective, not just in electronic communication services, but in any use of radio spectrum, be it in transport, be it in education, be it in public services, defence, research and development, and so on. So its remit is quite broad. Importantly, one consequence of the new EU, of the 2009 framework, which is required to be transposed in all member states by May of this year, is that it opens the way for the RSPG to issue an opinion or to produce reports on specific radio spectrum policy issues, if so requested by the European Parliament or the Council. We look forward to providing valuable inputs into decision making in this way. The new framework also calls for the Commission to set out objectives and strategic plans for the use and harmonisation of spectrum across the EU under what is to be known as the Radio Spectrum Policy Programme, which you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. In doing so, the Commission is expected to take utmost account of the views of the RSPG. And in fact, the RSPG is already active along these lines, having last year issued a response to the European Commission's request for an input into the RSPP. Over the years, since 2002, the RSPG has provided strategic advice and adopted opinions on areas varying from secondary trading, digital switchover, the digital dividend, and the collective use of spectrum. So there's quite a strong body of work which has already been provided by the Radio Spectrum Policy Group to the European Commission. And we would draw on that body of work in providing, and we drew on that body of work in providing our input into the Radio Spectrum Policy Programme. So there's a direct line from opinions we provided in the past to opinions that we provided recently and to advice that we will provide into the future. One of the key things that you requested that we talk about today was best practice in the use of spectrum, and I've just 4 points if I could make in relation to that. The first of these is enhanced cooperation and coordination and harmonisation of technical parameters for the use and availability of spectrum, which will lead to increased economies of scale and scope in order to facilitate the further development of the internal market. So there's a direct correlation between harmonisation of use, coordination of use, and scale and scope of economies. And that's a point that has been picked up by a number of presenters already today. The second key area is to ensure that the principles of service and technology neutrality are maintained consistently so as to maximise competition. Competition has been good for citizens in Europe, and we shouldn't lose sight of this. We should reduce access barriers and to support innovation across all frequency bands. Talking a little bit about innovation, we should facilitate the development of market mechanisms such as spectrum trading to increase the effectiveness and efficiency as to how spectrum can be used. Finally, in creating links between spectrum policies and other sectoral policies, we can take a more holistic approach to the development of spectrum policies, which will be more supportive of the high-level aims of the EU, not just in terms of technological development, but also in terms of economic growth, increased competitiveness, and a supportive ICT environment. As a matter of fact, when I was in the Commission's building earlier on today, I found a very useful postcard for the digital agenda, which outlines the 6 key points on one card, which includes broadband targets, the digital single market, digital inclusion, public services, research and innovation, and low-carbon economy. Radio spectrum has a key role to play in every single one of those, and Radio Spectrum Policy Group is very conscious of that. If I may just for a second briefly touch on, before concluding, we have outlined a very, very ambitious policy work programme for 2011, and also we've also considered some points. We've also mentioned some work items that could be considered into 2012. And I just briefly want to mention, if I may, 1 or 2 of those. First is regarding the European Commission's proposal in the RSPP to review spectrum use, which is euphemistically called the inventory, the spectrum inventory. And the RSPG, in completing its task, will set out a framework within which the review should be carried out, identifying stakeholders, defining parameters, and the general scope of the inventory. For example, it may be appropriate to define a frequency range to be reviewed, and the most likely of which will be the 300 megahertz to the 3 gigahertz range. And clearly this is a range that is of much interest for applications such as mobile broadband and broadcasting. And the emphasis there is on mobility, not just on mobile. If I may just pick one other as well, which is the second area of our focus, will be on the further examination of possibilities for the collective use of spectrum, specifically for the use of cognitive radio and so-called white spaces. This work is a key underpinning part of the future of innovation in the use of radio spectrum. And RSPG is very conscious of the role that we play in providing policy advice to stakeholders in how cognitive radio and the use of white spaces can be maximised from an innovative perspective to better support European consumers. Just in the interest of time, I might move on and not mention the other areas, because I think most stakeholders are clearly aware of the other items as well. If I may, just by conclusion, as I hope I've outlined, we have a very busy but rewarding programme ahead of us. We recognise in RSPG that economic growth and digital and social inclusion are key to the future competitiveness of the EU, and we are confident that spectrum and appropriate spectrum management policies will play a major part in achieving those aims. These are indeed challenging times for all of us, but with the appropriate policies in place and with suitable levels of coordination and cooperation, we can work together towards improving the quality of life for all our citizens. With that, I think I also might refer to our joint work with BEREC, and we have a continuing work stream with BEREC planned this year, in terms of examining the social and economic value of radio spectrum, which again is a very significant work stream. The RSPG, for its part, will move forward resolutely in respect of our work programme, and you can expect further opinions and reports this year from us addressing the key topics that I've mentioned. We also look forward to further advising the Commission and the Parliament on how best to optimise the use of radio spectrum, this scarce valuable resource, so as to stimulate economic growth and promote the internal market, and especially the digital agenda for the benefit of all European citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very, very much. And now to the companies. I have here Mr. Jonas Bengtsson from Tele2, and I would like to ask you a question. If we ever manage to introduce European pan-European license, would you bid for it? And what would it mean for the competition in Europe?
Would we bid for it? Thank you for the question. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question, Chairman. Would we bid for it? Well, since we're a listed company, I may not be at fully liberation to disclose that, but I guess it sort of depends on the terms and conditions for that. What would it do for competition, I think, is a more interesting question, maybe. I think one should be very careful. We operate also outside EU, for instance, in Russia. And Russia has a situation with 3 federal licenses throughout Russia, and also regional licenses, which we operate on. And Russian regions are typically sort of the size of a European smaller country. And I think the Russian experience has been very, very good with allowing both federal and regional competition. And for instance, which we like to mention as an example, of course, the difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are the 2 most developed regions in Russia, is that we have a license in St. Petersburg, but not in Moscow. And the price difference for consumers is roughly 50%. So it's 50% cheaper in St. Petersburg. And we like to say that the only difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg is Tele2. So I think that one should think carefully before introducing very, very large pan-European licenses, and maybe then taking away the very successful local competition that we have today. So long answer, but... Yeah. And okay, thank you very much for inviting me here, and I started a bit on the other end. I represent Tele2 here today. As I mentioned, we're a telephone operator operating in 11 countries, both inside and outside of EU. We are a full service provider. We have sort of all kind of products in our offering, but we are very much focused on mobile communication. So that brings it, the topic that I'm going to talk a bit about this evening is very important to us and very, very crucial, of course. And the subject for me today is how to allocate spectrum as to foster competition in the best way. And many of the things that I'm going to talk about has been mentioned earlier today, but I was going to try to put out 5 principles or 5 cornerstones that we have in our experience identified as very important for successful allocation of spectrum. And it's very short in the documents that have been handed out also. But first of all, the first cornerstone or guiding principle that we would like to point to is predictability. Much was mentioned earlier by Mr. Fontaine that is something that we like very much, to know what will happen and also to rely upon that it will continue to be valid for a number of years in the future, because these are very long-term investments we are talking about. And of course, spectrum allocation sort of sets the fundamental framework, the fundamental basis for the competition in a market. So it's very important to get it right from the beginning. We believe that it is very important that there are central policies, guidelines on an EU level that bring some clarity and predictability in the countries where we operate. We also think very interesting the things that were mentioned about inventories, and then also to give some, at least on a high level, a long-term plan for when and how spectrum will be released in different markets. Because of course, sort of, if new spectrum will be released later on, that can have a dramatic impact on the value and the business value of other spectrum. So it's very important for us to know in advance and have a high level of predictability here. The second point we feel is very important for this is that maybe not necessary to say, but still, that the basic principle for spectrum allocation should be to promote competition and to create sound market structures in the local markets. And I think, again, as I said, it's important to realize that the allocation of spectrum is actually the thing that will define markets through a long period of time. So it's important to get it right from the beginning. So we think that it is necessary and it should be required by regulators to actually conduct a careful market assessment of the national market before spectrum is allocated, so that one can try to predict what will the implications be for the market, what is the optimal allocation for that particular market. And again, I think that the Dutch example was a very good one, where one identified that there was a need and a room for new entrants in the higher bandwidths, and now also, I understand, in the lower, and set aside spectrum for new entrants, thereby promoting competition. And we believe that, as I said, that is something that should be the guiding principle for all national regulators while doing that, and not taking other considerations into account, for instance, maximizing state revenue from auctions, for instance, which is another, I guess, very tempting alternative, at least in these times, but maybe a bit short-sighted from our perspective. The third one that I would like to mention is that has also been touched upon earlier. We do believe that secondary trading or transferability is a positive thing and it should be introduced. However, first of all, we'd like to point out that this is more of a fine-tuning tool as we see it. If you miss the fundamentals in the beginning and don't get the basic allocation right, we do not think that secondary trading can repair that afterwards. We don't think that there will be incentives then for people who has a spectrum to sell it on further on. But if you get it right in the beginning, and again, continuing with the compliments here, I'm referring to the Dutch example. I think it's a very good tool to provide some flexibility for the very long terms that we're talking about over license time, that players are allowed to trade in spectrum over the time period of the license with adequate safeguards in order to prevent stockpiling and for strong players to buy out and block out competition, of course. But with that in place and with a sound allocation to start with, it is a good tool to allow flexibility and higher efficiency over time to allow market players to transfer spectrum between themselves. Moving into the maybe slightly more technical part of the allocation, as I mentioned, I think we believe that it needs to be taken into consideration that markets are different and that there are huge difference between different markets in kind of size, culture, population, geography, and all that. And we think that it should be up to each national regulator to, after a proper assessment, have the full toolbox to design the allocation in the way that's best suited for that particular market. Having said that, our experience is that one way that to us seems to be maybe the most efficient way to allocate spectrum is to use auctions, but not pure auctions, but to add what we call a dash of beauty contest to that, i.e. to have auctions but also add on those kind of elements that is necessary for that particular market to sort of steer the auction into the right direction for that. And that can be different in different markets. In my country, where I come from Sweden, and also in other Nordics, it's typically then combined with build-out requirements to ensure that we get good coverage in also rural areas and all that. Depending on market, it can be other things. In other, you can reserve for new entrants. You can have spectrum caps. You can add on requirements that you need to have some good experience, etc. That should be taken into account by the national regulator after having done that market assessment. But with that, we think that auctions, with that kind of a dash of beauty contest, has proven to be the most efficient and maybe the simplest way to allocate spectrum throughout. And finally, and a bit just to repeat, apart from that, we think that one should be rather careful when considering other obligations and other provisions for allocation. We think that the main thing is to ensure that allocation does foster a healthy and sound competition over time. There should be safeguards in place to stop stockpiling of spectrum or stop sort of the incumbents to block out competition, preferably by spectrum caps, a maximum amount of the total spectrum allowed to be held, etc. And most likely you should also need to consider some kind of requirement to actually use the spectrum over time so people do not just stockpile it and sit upon it afterwards. But other than that, we think that the market is and should be allowed to be as flexible as possible, and that way will foster the most efficient competition in this very dynamic area. And I think that most of the other things I thought to touch upon has already been debated by other members, so I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I give directly the floor to the International Office Director of Telefonica, Mr. Carlos Lopez Blanco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ALDE, for this invitation and the opportunity given to an operator like Telefonica with a strong presence in Europe, but outside of Europe too, to share your views with the ALDE group. Thank you for that. I have the difficult role of being the last speaker in the last panel, so I'll try to do my best, or at least I'll try to do it quickly. Let me start by three initial remarks regarding the problem of the broadband deployment. The first remark is, in our view, broadband extension, fixed and mobile broadband extension and the deployment of new generation networks is by far the most important strategic challenge that the telecom sector, that the European telecom sector is facing right now. Second, this is a challenge for the telecom sector, but this is a political challenge for the European Union and for Europe as a whole. And we need to define the role that Europe wants to play in the Internet and how to tackle from the European perspective the challenges of Internet in the global world. We think that Internet is the most critical economic infrastructure of the 21st century and is the most important platform for innovation. So for us, it's critical to understand which is and has to be the European model for the Internet world and the development of Internet. So this is not only a problem on how to deploy broadband and how to deploy new generation networks, but which is the role that Europe wants to play in the Internet world. And we think in that context that digital agenda is the right framework to deal with this group of issues. And third, initial remarks. Broadband deployment is a huge financial effort by telecom operators, and we need to justify that effort in front of the financial markets. And this is a very difficult task in a period of crisis like we are living today. We need a good story to convince the financial markets that the investment in new generation networks, that the investment in this new infrastructure is a good investment for us. In our view, we have to face at least two problems for the deployment of the new generation networks in Europe. The first one, to answer the question that which regulation do we need to foster investments in new generation networks. And let me have 2 comments on this. This is a critical factor, but in the past, Europe has been able to base its leadership in the telecom sector in a smart and good regulation. The GSMA is the perfect case of it. And second, we think that the critical role of regulation is to allocate the right incentives. And now the question is which incentives are needed, regulatory incentives, I mean, are needed to promote the private investment in broadband networks and in new generation networks. And I have to say that current regulation, in our view and in the view of other telecom operators, is not probably the best for this target. But I want to be focused in a second problem. A second factor, which depends mainly on the operators, and we think that is critical in this process too. And this problem is no other than the business model of the telecom industry, of the European telecom industry, and the economic model of Internet needed to fit this investment in high-speed networks in Europe. In other words, the challenge of the Internet model for operators and for the European ICT industry. And this is the other side of a more general political problem that I referred previously, which is the role that Europe wants to play in the Internet world in this 21st century. First of all, let me to say that the first starting point for this analysis should be to understand that the balance between operators and telecom companies and online service providers in the ICT sector in Europe and in the United States are different. And this is something that we need to understand from the very beginning. The United States has the dominant online service provider players, and Europe has no significant online service provider players. But Europe has a leading telecom industry. And we think that as a starting point, it's convenient not to be naive with this problem. Which problems are we facing? Which are the challenges that the telecom operators are facing in this new Internet world? At least let me stress 2 of them. The first one, the decoupling between traffic and revenue. This decoupling mainly coming from the growth of video content. You know that Cisco is forecasting that from now to 2014, traffic growth will grow in the networks by 90%, due mainly for video contents. And without solving this problem, this problem that means that traffic is growing but not revenue of the telecom operators, will not be possible to find financial resources for investment and growth and for the deployment of these new generation networks. And the second problem is that there is a critical factor behind this reality, which is the inefficiency of the current internet economic model. We think that this is a two-sided market in which none of the relevant agents, or none of the other two relevant agents, the end users and the content providers, have a single economic incentive to behave rationally in the way they are using the traffic and the networks. End users pay all traffic cost. Online service provider, none. And the business model of these online service providers, most of them American, is based on traffic growth, and the cost of the traffic is not relevant for the profitability of these online service providers, but is very relevant for the telecom network operators, which is at risk in our view. Now the internet as we know it. Now the internet as we know it in Europe right now. But we think that this at risk with these problems that we need to face is the growth of the internet in Europe, the condition of internet as a platform for innovation that Europe needs, and the competitive position of Europe in the global economy in the 21st century. Because we are experiencing a transfer of value from one part of the ICT sector to the other, from one region in the world to the other. And we need, from Europe and from European perspective, to rethink the whole internet economic model. And we think that we need to discuss and to rebuild the basics of the internet economic model in those factors affecting the system, affecting the operators, and affecting the European ITC sector. That means, in our view, that at least we need to rebalance the way in which we charge our end users. I am not saying that we have to overcharge or to increase the level of prices of end users, because it's not our proposal. But we have to be conscious of the principle that more payment. The second, to redesign the whole international interconnection system based on peering that we think that is simply not viable in the context of an asymmetric traffic growth that we are going to experience in the close future. And third, to introduce quality of service in the public internet. We think that is critical, that is very important to improve the quality of the services that we are able to provide in the public internet. And finally, to promote new managed services in a platform for new innovative services. These services that the European citizens need and deserve, like e-health, transport, smart grids, financial services, etc., etc. How to do it? We think that considering at least three principles. The first one, to be focused on users with more quality, more rational pricing system, and guaranteeing privacy and data protection and the protection of the IP rights. We think that this is critical in the European context to promote and to preserve the European model of data privacy protection that we do actually have. Second principle, rationality, transparency, and non-discrimination by network operators. And third principle, cooperation of players. That means that we need to have a common vision between all the agents of the internet, of the telecom sector in Europe, and we think that we have. This is probably one of the issues in which it's difficult to see different positions in the European telecom sector. Second, to collaborate with regulators. I think that this new model of economic model does not depend mainly on regulation, but we need to have a consistent regulation with this. And third, and very important, to consider that content providers should be considered as partners in the telecom sector, and that we need in Europe, in a desperate way, to find the way of promote and launch a very strong European content provider industry. So we think that we need to rethink this model of the Internet in the European perspective, and we think that we need to rebalance the Internet value chains, that we need to permit and promote the growth of innovation over the Internet, and we need to promote a European Internet model that permits us to feed the new investments and to create a competitive European content industry. Let me conclude by saying that we experienced in the 90s a virtuous circle that allowed Europe to be the leading mobile region in the world and the leading telecom, to have the leading telecom sector in the world. And this happened because we have a combination of talented industry and a very smart regulation. So we know how to do it. And our challenge now in the 21st century Internet world is to recreate this virtuous circle again and to be able to compete with other regions in the world, with Asia and with America, for the lead of this Internet in the 21st century. Thank you for your attention and your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for 5 very inspiring introductions. I will now open the floor for questions. The interpretation ends here at now, but I think we can continue until 7:30. First on the mic is Lena Ek.
Thank you. And thank you for very interesting speeches. Now, we face, and that's one of the reasons why we organized this seminar, a number of new legislative proposals from telecoms, for ICT, for internal market, for growth, for financing of infrastructure projects, and so on and so forth. I was very interested in the proposal to remodel the Internet. I must say I'm very skeptic. What I think the Americans have done more successfully than we have in Europe is the integration of computers and telephones. That's one of our problems. And that causes the redistribution, of course, of income and revenues, which is admittedly a problem. But I don't think that the European way of, how do we boost this market? Can we find any good regulation? That's the typical European question. And the American question is, how can we boost this market? Have we any good ideas? Have we any new products? So for me, it's more a market perspective on how to win the economic battle of income from Internet and the services that we find. And I think that the customers, meaning those who use their telephones for what used to be computer work or computer information or participation, will have moved far beyond. So I think that what will save, admittedly, the digital agenda is a very good platform, and we do need an internal market, and that would be, for me, it's more like, instead of reinventing and putting European legislation on the function of Internet, well, if it's on net neutrality, I'm all for it, but otherwise not. But it should be new services and a new way of generating incomes and new ideas. So for me, it's more innovation than legislation. And maybe this is a reaction to the whole of the panel, because it's been a panel that's been very oriented towards legislation, and that is understandable. But how do we make Europe competitive? That is for me the overall important question.
We take some couple of questions. Adina and Mr. Ring afterwards.
Yes, thank you, and congratulations to all the panelists. It is an important debate for us to to learn more from you. How do you see all these issues of allocation of spectrum? And I found from what I heard a lot of ideas that I share, and then it makes me more confident in judging these issues. But jumping on what, or continuing on what Lena was saying, it was also intriguing for me, from the last panelist. There are some things I've heard coming from telecom, from G5 companies, we know them, thinking about the new model for internet or the new model for telecom. I don't know which one is it in reality. While you are talking about a new business model, I totally understand and I support you. I think it's needed and we have to look in such things. But when you talk about a European internet model, then you lose me, because I don't see internet as something would have a European model, an American model, an Asian model. I think we won't win if we think from this angle. And now it comes a question for you. You said at some point, Mr. Lopez Blanco, you were talking about the asymmetry of traffic. And I want to ask you, what is the relevance of the asymmetry of traffic when we talk about data? And if you are thinking of termination rates for data, can you assure us or reassure us that we won't end up with internet and data in a model similar to the roaming model, which was, in my opinion, a failure for European citizens and for European model generally? This is my question. Thank you.
And we take once more, Mr. Ring.
Thank you, Chairman Rode. My question is quite brief and is directed to Mike Byrne, the chair of the Radio Spectrum Policy Group. Allow me to call that the mother of the RSPP. My question is about the development in Europe of the still more spectrum-efficient radio technologies for the further freeing up of more vital spectrum for instance, governmental services such as safety and disaster relief, as now is recognized in the draft RSPP. Thank you very much for that. Now comes the question. Now that the remarkable European development of the terrestrial digital TV distribution standard, the good old DVB-T, resulted in as much as 72 megahertz large digital dividend spectrum, which now is allocated to the coordinated commercial broadband distribution. But going forward, are you, Mr. Byrne, aware of any similar or other thoughts amongst member states that you work with to materialize further coordinated spectrum for the fulfillment of the provisions of the RSPP article, which is 7.3, if you, of course you know that by heart, on the creation of what you could call, actually Article 7.3, you could call it One Europe for Public Protection and Disaster Relief. Once it's officially published, do you have any thoughts there from your work? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we take just one more, and yes, the lady.
Can I speak in French or? No.
No, I'm sorry. The interpretation, it's too late.
So,
but could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Stella Velig. I'm a physician informatics. And I know a little the networks and internet. And I would like to speak here from the basis from a user, a normal user from a European family. And I don't want to repeat what Madame says, is a very important thing that I wanted to propose it. The voice over IP possibility to phone is a very practical one, is a very light to use it, and is very cheap. And so I propose for Europe, or I don't know if it's possible, then every internet provider and every mobile provider must include a voice over IP connection for the PC and for the mobile phone. What means that? You must install a tool and you must propose some prices. And I think that with these technologies will have a very big future. So.
Okay, thank you. And now let's go to the panel. And at least the two politicians, Lena Ek and Ms. Valjan, addressed some remarks to Mr. Blanco. So I think we will start with Mr. Blanco.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Very, very briefly. First, think on the role of regulation. I think that I said from the very beginning that I wanted not to speak on regulation, that regulation has to play a critical role in the deployment of new generation networks. But for us, there is a very, very important factor here, which is the business models in the internet world. And that we think that we need to understand is that we need to adapt our business models to the reality of the internet, having into account the specific situation of Europe. We understand perfectly that Europe is, the internet is a global phenomenon, but Europe has a specific characteristic that we need to understand. And this drives me to the second question, which is, in principle, I think that this is not, of course, this is Telefónica's viewpoint. This is probably the point of some big European telecom operators, but I can assure you that most of the European operators, medium-sized, small operators, and maybe the cable operators too, have a very similar view of the problems that we are facing with this new reality of the internet. That internet is a global phenomenon, of course, and there is no European internet, of course not. But we need to understand where are the European strengths to compete in the internet global world. This is the message behind our proposal and our thinking. We need to understand when we design business models and when we have regulation, which are the strengths and the weaknesses of the European industry. And we need to understand that we can be very strong building platforms. But for the time being, we are not very good launching some kind of new services. And we need to understand this. And the strength of Europe belongs in the networks, in the ability to transform these networks into innovative platforms that can permit the growth of a new content industry in Europe. That we think that this is one of the problems that we are facing, that we don't have in Europe a strong, pure internet industry. And finally, the asymmetry of traffic. So we think the asymmetry of traffic is essentially a problem at a wholesale international interconnection level. Because that is happening in the internet in the last years is that bidding is dropping and streaming is growing very rapidly because the new video services. And in this context, in which we are moving from, let's say, a interchange ratio of traffic of, let's say, 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 to ratios of 15 to 1. And in those contexts, the system of interconnection by bidding is not viable. And we need to find a different one. Considering that the international wholesale interconnection system, as it works, is not efficient, is not transparent, and is not viable, because it's based only in the pure peering interchange of traffic, without any kind of economic translation. And we think that we need to rethink the whole interconnection system, not at national level, but a wholesale international level, and trying to make an efficient market, transparent and with rules that permit us to interchange traffic in an efficient way. Because this is the only sector, in which the interconnection works in that way. And this, we think that in the future will not be possible to keep that system as it is today.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but Mr. Byrne has to leave now. But there was a specific question for you.
If I may, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I have a flight to catch, but if I could, I'd like to answer a couple of the questions that were asked. One, if I may, or a couple of them, two of them as a national regulator, which I am a commissioner in Comreg, and then the last question in relation to the Radio Spectrum Policy Group from Stefan. The first question from Mrs. Eck, which was in relation to remodelling of the internet. Do we need a remodel? Should we remodel the internet, or do we need a European model for the internet? And I think, as had been quite graphically described by Dr. Amoroso, we are where we are. We're not dealing with a greenfield scenario here. But I do believe that we need to think about the relationship that's there. And in some ways, there's a paradigm. There's the use of the internet as a channel to market, whether that's for commercial services or public information services, and that's good. But there's also the relationship between the individual as a consumer and the internet, and the concerns that the consumer has in relation to security, to content, to privacy, to rights as a consumer, and all of those aspects as they impact on cross-border trade. So there is a paradigm that I think needs to be looked at, and I think it's very useful for the European Union and the European community to examine that, given the fact that we are 27 different member states. One last point on that is that goes back to the, if I could, going back to the RSPG perspective for a second, which is our use of radio spectrum. Consumers have become very used to now using a single device to receive all of their needs. They no longer use a device per need, but will use a single device more often than not for all needs. Now, that's empowering the internet in a way which was not imagined like 10 years ago, never mind 20 years ago. My own background actually is computer science, so I'm familiar with the TCP/IP layers, and what we're looking at is a collision between one science and another science. So regulating that is very difficult. The applications, some of the most brilliant applications that will come onto the marketplace in the next 3 years have yet to be invented. So we cannot get in the way of the progress of that. So that's one point. In relation to, just if I could for a second, just to talk in relation to Stefan's question, a really, really good question, which is around the importance of a single coordinated or harmonised use for disaster recovery and public safety relief, and the ability for technologies to work cross-border in the event of such catastrophes. Absolutely correct, that should happen. Now, how is it going to happen? You spoke about the availability of a digital dividend, and before becoming Vice Chair of Radio Spectrum, of the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, I chaired the digital dividend, the working group on the digital dividend, which provided the opinion, which was taken on board by the European Commission and so on and so forth, which provided the dates and also identified the 72 megahertz of spectrum. A couple of things will feed into this into the future. One, there will be a continuation of technological innovation in transmission platforms. So we're not going to stop progress. And as you mentioned, from DTT has shown us the DVB-T and now to DVB-T2 standards, platforms will become more efficient. As they become more efficient, they'll become less demanding on the spectrum that they currently use, which will provide potential for another dividend. So yes, it will happen, but I think it's not just a single regulatory-led initiative. It also requires the continuation of competition by the equipment manufacturers to become more efficient in how the devices that they're providing uses radio spectrum as a valuable resource. I'm sorry, there was one other point as well, which is, yes, the question in relation to roaming. And I think it is a very, very valid question, and I think Europe has lessons to learn, and I'm speaking as a national regulator here in this regard, where we have a very high usage of mobile services in Ireland. I think it's illogical for a consumer to travel abroad and to think about how much it's costing them to use a mobile service. In other words, I'll now switch this off and I'll go and find an internet cafe which will cost me less because I'm going online. That's illogical. And I think mobile operators in particular need to consider, are they incentivizing consumers to use the devices that they're making available to them? So I think there are lessons to be learned in relation to data roaming from our history on voice roaming. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to depart, if that's okay.
Thank you very much for coming. Mr. Fortin.
Well, just perhaps maybe a personal response to Madam Ook. You said there was a lot of talk about legislation and regulators. Well, if you invite regulators, you get this. I'm sorry to to say that. What I'd like to stress is with the new package, I think that it gives enough room to regulators to take a backward position if competition evolves and to take a forward position if it doesn't. So I think it is very much up to the independence of the regulator to do what it thinks it should do. And the same goes for the net neutrality. But one general statement. It is an absolute illusion to think that regulators and legislators can make this market. It is the industry that is going to. It is the industry that is going to do it. And what regulators should do, there's no remonopolization. There is entry, there is competition, but it is industry. And sometimes I get all these people telling me what to do on how to make things competitive. They make their own competitiveness. It is industry, and that is sometimes a little bit forgotten when there is difficulties. People look at governments, at legislators, at regulators. They set the scene. We make it possible, as I've tried to outline, to make investment, but while not killing the competition. That is basically why we're here to do. And I think, but that is the way to look at it. So not look at it from legislation or regulation in the first place, but a secondary role. And that, I think, is the role that we, at least as regulators, should take. We are in a liberal environment here, so I think that should be music to your ears.
Thank you. You want to comment on Mr. Poltridge?
Yeah, just a couple of quick remarks. First, a rather flippant one. You have to be careful what you wish for if you start talking about the change of the internet model. I think of that chart, I draw your attention to Australia, New Zealand, Singapore have decided to make a change to the model. And that wouldn't necessarily be along lines that a lot of the big telcos would like. But basically they have drawn the conclusion that maybe the current model doesn't work for the infrastructure they want, and they're going down a different path, which is splitting telcos, which is another path that the telcos may not like. It's an option. And some OECD governments are moving in that direction, which is a bit of a surprise to me, but anyway, that's the way it's going. In answer to the question on how does Europe compete, I'd sort of change that slightly. I'd say how do OECD countries compete? And you may get two different answers from the OECD, one from my colleagues in the economics department, but I think in the sense that you mean the question in terms of the ICT sector, I think it's pretty clear, and that's innovation. That's how OECD, that's how Europe competes, and the internet is a large part of that. And I don't think there's anyone in this room that doesn't think that. That's how. And so the different models that I spoke about, it's an open question, which is the one that's going to be most efficient. But what they're all trying to do is to generate innovation, and that's the only way OECD countries are going to compete.
Mr. Bengtsson?
Very, very brief then. Well, I agree fully with that regulation cannot create a competition, but regulation can destroy competition. So I think, again, this is sort of limited resources, and therefore it would be naive to say that we don't need regulation. I'm all for that we should have as little regulation as possible. But I think we do need to secure that, in this instance, I'm talking mostly about natural limited resources such as spectrum, is allocated in an efficient way. then basically regulation can stop. I say basically, but you need to get the fundamentals right. That was just my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, yesterday a broadcaster representative suggested that we first investigate and then create a report on the needs for the next 2 decades before acting here in the Parliament and acting in the Commission. I don't think we have time for that. And we don't have any more time for today. Time is up. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you to our speakers today. Thank you very much. It was very inspiring, very interesting, and very helpful. Thank you.